Clara and I had been together for 7 years, married for 5, and while we weren't the kind of overly affectionate couple who posted perfect vacation selfies on Instagram, we had a connection. A solid one, or so I thought. That we had our little routines. Saturday morning coffee at the same diner, evening binges watching crime documentaries, and random road trips when life seemed too predictable. We even had plans to finally start a family, which we'd been talking about for years. To the outside world, and honestly, to me at the time, we were the couple who had it all figured out, but like any good story, the cracks started to show when I least expected them. It all started with her new job. Clara worked in marketing, but when she got a big promotion, it was because of the frequent trips. She was thrilled. "This is really important to us, Tom," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. I believed her. Why not? I mean, I was proud of her. The first few trips went smoothly, quick conferences on the weekend, business meetings in neighboring cities. She would come home tired but happy, telling me about new clients and working lunches, but then everything changed. Her trips became longer. First, they were weekends. Then they stretched out to a whole week. Sometimes she would be gone for 10 days. She would return distant, absent-minded, as if her mind was still 30,000 feet in the air. Her phone, which she had previously left lying around without thinking, suddenly became an extension of her hand. Always buzzing, always face down on the table. And when I asked who she was texting, she would wave me off with a casual, "Just work, baby." But it wasn't just the phone. The way she looked at me had changed. The warmth in her eyes had faded. The conversations that had once flowed effortlessly between us had become strained. She stopped laughing at my jokes, stopped asking about my day, and when we were together, it felt like she wasn't really there. Like a part of her was somewhere else. At first I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the stress of her new role, the pressure of constant travel. But deep down I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After months of Clara's constant travel and growing distance, she suggested we take a vacation together. Somewhere warm, somewhere far from work and stress. "Let's hit reset," she said one night over dinner, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. And despite the pit in my stomach, I jumped at the chance. Maybe this was what we needed, a getaway to reignite the spark. We booked a trip to Hawaii, a place we'd always talked about but never visited. It felt like the perfect escape. I imagined lazy days on the beach, tropical drinks in hand, and maybe, just maybe, finding our way back to each other. But the minute we boarded the plane, I knew something was off. Clara was unusually tense. She kept glancing around the cabin, her eyes darting to the flight crew like she was looking for someone, or avoiding someone. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just pre-flight jitters, even though she'd flown 100 times before. But when the flight attendants started their safety demonstration, I noticed the way her gaze locked onto one of them. Ethan, tall, fit, with that easy charm that flight attendants seem to have. He moved down the aisle with a confident stride, flashing a polite smile at passengers as he passed. But when his eyes met Clara's, something shifted. It wasn't the look of a professional doing his job. It was something else, something familiar. And Clara? She froze, her face flushed, her hands fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, and for a split second, she looked like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't, but she quickly recovered, turning back to me with a forced smile. "You okay?" I asked, watching her closely. "Yeah," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just tired." But I wasn't buying it. As the plane took off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped into the middle of a story I didn't know the ending to. And I had a sinking suspicion it wasn't going to be a happy one. The flight was long, 6 hours from the west coast to Hawaii, and every minute felt heavier than the last. Clara kept shifting in her seat, pretending to scroll through her phone, flipping through the in-flight magazine without reading a word. But what really got me was how often her eyes drifted toward the front of the plane, toward Ethan, the flight attendant. I tried to act normal. I made small talk, asked if she wanted anything to eat, tried to lighten the mood. But her responses were clipped, distracted, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was the same distance I'd been feeling for months, but now, trapped together on this plane, it was impossible to ignore. Halfway through the flight, Clara said she needed to stretch her legs. "I'm going to walk around a bit," she mumbled, barely meeting my eyes before heading toward the back of the plane. I watched her go, something in my gut screaming that this wasn't just a casual walk. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. When she didn't come back, I felt that gnawing suspicion turn into something darker. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she just needed space, I thought. Maybe she's in the bathroom, or chatting with another passenger, but deep down, I knew, and that's when I noticed her phone. She'd left it in the seat pocket in front of her, a rare slip. Clara never left her phone unattended. It was always glued to her hand like an extra limb. My heart pounded as I stared at it. I knew I shouldn't look. Trust was the foundation of any marriage, right? But trust only works when both people are playing by the same rules. I grabbed the phone, my hands trembling. No passcode. That was the first red flag. Clara always had a passcode. Why would she suddenly remove it? I opened her messages, and there it was, Ethan. His name stared back at me like a slap to the face. I tapped the thread, and what I saw made my stomach drop. "I can't wait to see you in the air again. Last time in the crew quarters was unforgettable. Same here. Let's sneak away after drink service. I miss your hands on me." Counting down the minutes. I felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the cabin. My heart raced, my vision blurred, and for a second, I thought I might actually be sick. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I was rebuilding my marriage with, was sneaking around with a flight attendant, and not just on the ground, but on the plane we were on together. I scrolled further, my stomach turning with every new message. Photos. Explicit descriptions of what they'd done in those cramped crew quarters. Plans for this flight. While I sat just a few feet away, clueless. I slammed her phone back into the seat pocket, my mind spinning. I felt trapped, not just by the plane, but by the realization that my marriage was over. Right there, 35,000 feet above the Pacific, everything I thought I knew about my life unraveled. And Clara, she was somewhere on this plane, with him. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the fact that she didn't even try to hide it. I sat there, gripping the armrest, my mind racing faster than the plane itself. Every word, every photo, every plan I'd just read echoed in my head like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. And Clara? She was somewhere on this plane with Ethan, probably laughing at how easy it had been to fool me, but not anymore. I wasn't going to sit there for the next 3 hours, stewing in silence while they snuck around like teenagers. I needed to confront her. Now that I stood up, my legs shaky but fueled by adrenaline, and made my way down the narrow aisle toward the back of the plane. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure other passengers could hear it. I passed rows of people oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away. When I reached the rear galley, I stopped. There they were, Clara and Ethan, standing way too close near the service cart. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand brushing his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't the kind of friendly, casual touch you give to a stranger. It was intimate. Familiar, and in that moment, something in me snapped. "Clara," I said, my voice louder than I intended. She froze. Ethan turned first, his smile fading the second he saw me. But Clara? She didn't move. For a second, it was like she was trying to process whether this was actually happening, whether I was really standing there, watching her in the middle of her betrayal. When she finally met my eyes, her face went pale. "Tom, what are you doing back here?" "What am I doing back here?" The audacity of that question hit me like a punch to the gut. "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back, my voice low but sharp. "But I already know the answer." Her eyes darted to Ethan, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the nearest emergency exit. Clara, ever the quick thinker, tried to recover. "Tom, you're overreacting. We were just talking. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, just talking? Is that what you call sneaking off mid-flight and sending him those messages? I pulled out her phone from my pocket, holding it up like evidence in a trial, her face twisted, a mixture of anger and fear flashing across her features. You went through my phone. You left it in the seat pocket, Clara. You weren't exactly being careful. I leaned in, lowering my voice so only they could hear. But I guess you didn't think you had to be. Ethan tried to step in, his voice shaky. Look, man, I cut him off with a glare. Don't. You don't get to say anything. The tension was thick, the hum of the plane the only sound filling the space between us. Clara's mask finally cracked. She crossed her arms, her defensiveness kicking in like clockwork. You've been distant for months, Tom. What did you expect? She hissed, like I was the problem here. You're always so wrapped up in your own world. I needed something. I stared at her, stunned by how easily she twisted the narrative. And this is your answer? Cheating on me with some flight attendant while I'm sitting a few rows away? Her face hardened, but I could see the guilt simmering beneath. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, I wouldn't have had to look somewhere else. The words stung more than I expected, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I stepped back, my decision already made. You know what, Clara? You can have him. I turned to Ethan, who looked like he regretted every life choice that led him to this moment. Good luck. And with that, I walked back to my seat, leaving them standing there, exposed in the harsh fluorescent lights of the galley. But even as I sat down, staring out the window at the endless ocean below, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That I sank back into my seat, my heart still pounding from the confrontation. The cabin buzzed with the usual in-flight noises, murmured conversations, the hum of the engines, the occasional clink of a drink cart, but everything felt distant, like I was underwater. I stared out the window, trying to process what had just happened, but the anger was too fresh. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clara's face, her smug deflection, her cold justification. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, the words echoed in my head, each time hitting harder than the last. That I couldn't believe it. I didn't believe it. This wasn't just about the affair. It was the fact that she tried to pin it on me. Like I was the reason she'd decided to sneak around with some random flight attendant. I thought back to every moment I'd supported her, the long nights waiting for her to come home from business trips, the times I encouraged her to take opportunities, to travel, to grow. I'd been there for her every step of the way, and this was how she repaid me, a betrayal at 35,000 feet. That I felt a tap on my shoulder, snapping me out of my thoughts. That it was Ethan. That I turned, glaring at him, my jaw clenched so tight I thought I might crack a tooth. Look, man, he started, his voice low, trying not to attract attention. I didn't know you were on this flight. I didn't mean for this to happen. I laughed bitterly. Didn't mean for this to happen? Like it was some accident he tripped into. Save it, I muttered, waving him off. You've done enough. He stood there for a moment, like he wanted to say more, but the look in my eyes must have told him it was a bad idea. He finally backed off, disappearing down the aisle. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. There were still hours left on this flight, and I was trapped. No escape, no way to clear my head, just me and the reality of what my life had become. And then, as if the universe wasn't done messing with me, Clara came back to her seat. She slid in beside me like nothing had happened, her face calm, almost bored. She didn't say a word, just pulled out her phone and started scrolling through it like we were two strangers sitting next to each other. The audacity. After a few minutes of silence, I couldn't take it anymore. That's it? I hissed under my breath, keeping my voice low to avoid a scene. You're not even going to apologize? She sighed, like I was the one causing trouble. What do you want me to say, Tom? You already made up your mind. I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. Yeah, I did make up my mind. But I guess I just wanted to know if you'd even pretend to feel bad. She didn't answer. She just kept scrolling through her phone, like I wasn't even there, and in that moment, I realized something: the woman sitting next to me wasn't the woman I married. Maybe she never was. I spent the rest of the flight staring out the window, counting down the minutes until we landed. But deep down, I knew that even when the plane touched down, the real turbulence was just beginning. When the plane finally began its descent into Honolulu, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that I was finally getting off that claustrophobic metal tube where my marriage had crumbled in real time. Dread because I knew this wasn't just a bad dream I could shake off once we landed. This was my new reality. Clara hadn't said a word since our brief exchange mid-flight. She sat stiffly beside me, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her. It was like she was waiting for me to explode, to make a scene, but I was done giving her that kind of energy. The silence between us wasn't tense, it was final. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, I realized something: this trip, the one she called our fresh start, was never about fixing us. It was about her final escape. Maybe she thought a few days in paradise would distract me from the truth, or maybe she wanted to keep up appearances until she figured out how to leave without looking like the villain, but I wasn't going to make it that easy for her. When we finally disembarked, the humid Hawaiian air hit me like a wall. Normally, I would have breathed it in, excited for the adventure ahead. But not this time. This wasn't a vacation, it was the aftermath. We walked through the terminal in silence, side by side but miles apart. I could feel the weight of her glances, like she was waiting for me to crack, to beg for an explanation. But I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. As we waited for our luggage at baggage claim, she finally spoke. "So, what now?" Her voice was casual, like she was asking what I wanted for dinner, not addressing the fact that she just detonated our marriage mid-air. I turned to her, feeling the weight of everything I wanted to say pressing against my chest. But I kept it simple: "We're done, Clara." Her face barely flinched. She just nodded, like she'd been expecting it all along. "Fine," she said, her tone as flat as her expression. "I'll get a hotel." I didn't argue. I didn't offer to talk it out or suggest we figure things out after some sleep. I just watched her walk away, her suitcase rolling behind her, until she disappeared into the crowd, and just like that, she was gone. I stood there for a few minutes, letting the reality of it all sink in. The woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with had walked out of my life with barely a backward glance. But as much as it hurt, there was a strange sense of relief in knowing I didn't have to fight for something that was already lost. I grabbed my bag and headed for the exit. This trip wasn't going to be the one we'd planned, but maybe it could be the one I needed. I stepped out of the airport, the thick Hawaiian air wrapping around me like a blanket I didn't ask for. The sound of ukuleles and the sight of tourists buzzing with excitement about their vacations felt surreal. I'm supposed to be one of them, I thought. But here I was, dragging a suitcase full of clothes I packed for a future that no longer existed. I had two options: I could wallow in the hotel room I'd booked for what was supposed to be a romantic getaway, or I could figure out how to make the best out of the worst situation I'd ever faced. For once, I chose me. I checked into the hotel alone. The receptionist gave me a polite, rehearsed smile as she handed over the key cards for the ocean view suite I'd booked, for two. I almost laughed at the irony. I wanted to tell her the story, to spill the ridiculous, soap opera-like mess that had just unfolded 35,000 feet above the Pacific. But instead, I just nodded, thanked her, and took the keys. When I got to the room, I stood there for a minute, staring at the king-sized bed, the champagne I had pre-ordered chilling on the table, and the balcony overlooking the endless blue waves. I didn't feel sad. I felt angry that I had been blind to Clara's lies for so long. Angry that I had invested years of my life in someone who could so easily betray me and then walk away without a second thought. But beneath that anger was something else, something I didn't expect: relief, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't stuck in the limbo of wondering what was wrong. I knew. And knowing meant I could finally move forward. That night, instead of sitting alone in the room drowning in regret, I went out. I found a small beachside bar, the kind with live music and locals who didn't care who you were or why you were there. I ordered a drink, sat down at the bar, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself breathe. As the night went on, I struck up conversations with strangers. I laughed. I listened to their stories. And somewhere between the second and third drink, I realized something important. Clara's betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was just the end of ours, and maybe, just maybe, that was the best thing that could have happened to me. The next morning, I woke up with the sound of waves crashing against the shore, sunlight spilling through the sheer curtains of the hotel room. For a moment, I forgot everything. For a brief, blissful second, I was just another guy on vacation in paradise, but then it hit me: Clara, Ethan, the mid-flight betrayal. The memory crashed into me like the waves outside, but this time, it didn't knock the wind out of me. It was just there, like a scar healing over. I decided that if I was going to be stuck in Hawaii, I wasn't going to waste it. I spent the next few days doing everything we had planned. Without her, I booked a snorkeling trip, something Clara always said she was too scared to try. Floating above the colorful reefs, watching schools of fish dart below me, I felt weightless in a way I hadn't in months. The water was cold, refreshing, and it washed away more than just the salt from my skin. It washed away the lingering bitterness clinging to me since that flight that I hiked up Diamond Head at sunrise, something Clara would have complained about because, why wake up early on vacation? But standing at the summit, the sun stretching its golden fingers across the island, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known I needed. Every step I took, every breath of fresh ocean air, was a reminder that I was free. Free from the lies, the manipulation, the constant guessing. Clara's betrayal didn't define me, it freed me. One night, back at the beachside bar I'd found on my first night, I met Emily. She was sitting alone at the bar, sipping a drink, eyes glued to the book in front of her. We struck up a conversation, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I found myself genuinely enjoying someone's company without any baggage attached. We talked about everything: travel, life, the crazy twists it throws at you when you least expect it. I didn't tell her about Clara. Not because I was hiding it, but because, for once, I didn't need to talk about it. Emily wasn't a rebound or a distraction. She was just a reminder that life moves on, whether you're ready for it or not. As the trip wound down, I realized something. I had come to Hawaii to fix my marriage, but I was leaving having fixed myself, and that was worth more than any second honeymoon could have given me. Back home, the first thing that hit me was the silenced sound of Clara's suitcase wheels rolling into the hallway. No fake cheerful, "Hey, babe," greeting me at the door. Just me and Max, our golden retriever, wagging his tail like he hadn't noticed the world had fallen apart. I dropped my bags and sank into the couch, staring at the ceiling, letting the reality settle in. But instead of the crushing weight I expected, I felt light. Like I'd finally let go of something I'd been carrying for too long. I thought that would be the end of it, but a few days later, my phone buzzed. It was her. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen, my heart unexpectedly quickening. Talk? About what? Wasn't everything clear at 35,000 feet? But curiosity, that annoying little itch, wouldn't let me ignore it. I didn't respond right away. I let it sit there, like an unwelcome guest at the door, wondering if ignoring it long enough would make it go away, but it didn't. A day later, another message came. "I'm sorry. Please, Tom. I need to explain." Explain what, exactly? That she didn't mean it? That it was a mistake? The images of her flirting with Ethan mid-flight were burned into my brain. What could she possibly say to undo that? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to hear her out, not for her, but for me. Maybe closure wasn't something that came from ignoring the wreckage. Maybe it came from walking through it, one last time. So, I replied. "Meet me at the cafe on 5th tomorrow. Noon." The next day, I sat at our old spot, the place where we used to grab coffee on lazy Sunday mornings. It felt surreal, like I was stepping into a scene from a life that wasn't mine anymore. Clara arrived 10 minutes late, as if even now, she couldn't show up on time for the things that mattered. She looked different, tired, worn down, but still wearing that same mask of calm indifference. She slid into the seat across from me, her hands clasped around her coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Tom," she started, her voice softer than I expected. "I'm sorry." I said nothing. I just waited. "I know what I did was unforgivable. But it wasn't just about him," she said, her eyes flicking down to the table. "I was unhappy. I felt trapped." I let out a bitter laugh. "And sneaking around with a flight attendant was your solution?" She flinched, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel it, the weight of what she'd done. "I made mistakes," she whispered. "But I don't want to lose what we had." That's when it hit me, she wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. Sorry that the safety net of our marriage had disappeared beneath her feet. That I leaned back, finally feeling the last piece of the puzzle click into place. "You already lost it, Clara," I said quietly. "I just didn't realize it until now." She didn't argue. She just nodded, like deep down, she'd known it too, and that was it. No dramatic ending. No tearful goodbyes, just the quiet understanding that we were done. After that final conversation with Clara, something shifted inside me. I walked out of that cafe feeling lighter, like I'd been carrying around a weight I didn't even realize was there until it was gone. The anger, the confusion, the constant replaying of what-ifs, they all started to fade. I realized that closure isn't always some big, dramatic moment. Sometimes, it's just the quiet acceptance that things are over, and there's nothing left to fix. Back at home, I started making changes. I packed up the photos of us, the wedding album, the vacation snapshots, the framed picture from our first anniversary. I didn't throw them out. Not yet. But I boxed them up, sealing them away like a chapter of a book I'd finished reading. I redecorated the apartment, moving furniture around, repainting the living room walls a shade of blue Clara always hated. It wasn't about revenge or spite, it was about reclaiming my space, making it feel like mine again. I even found myself smiling more, laughing at dumb TV shows I hadn't watched in years, reconnecting with friends I'd unintentionally drifted away from during my marriage. Life felt new, like I was finally breathing in fresh air after being stuck in a room that had been slowly suffocating me. One evening, while walking Max through the park, I ran into Emily again, the woman I'd met at the beachside bar in Hawaii. We hadn't exchanged numbers back then, but seeing her now felt like life giving me a second chance at something unexpected. We grabbed coffee, and what started as a casual conversation turned into hours of talking and laughing. It wasn't forced. It wasn't complicated. It was just easy. For the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't afraid of being hurt again, because I knew I could survive it. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I kept seeing each other. It wasn't anything serious at first, just coffee, long walks with Max, and conversations that felt effortless. But there was something refreshing about being with someone who didn't carry the weight of my past, someone who knew me now, not the version of me from a broken marriage. One evening, as we sat at a little outdoor cafe downtown, watching the city lights flicker to life, Emily asked me something that caught me off guard. "Do you think you've really moved on from everything?" I paused, considering her question. It wasn't easy to answer. The scars were still there, but they didn't hurt the way they used to. The betrayal, the lies, the confrontation at 35,000 feet, they were part of my story, but they didn't define me anymore. "I think I have," I said finally. "Not because I've forgotten what happened, but because I've learned from it. I know what I deserve now." Emily smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Good. Because you deserve a lot more than what you got." Her words stuck with me, not because they were comforting, but because they were true. I did deserve more. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just saying it, I believed it. Life moved forward, as it always does. Days turned into weeks, and the sting of the past dulled with each sunrise. I found myself excited about the future again, not just because of Emily, but because I had rediscovered something I thought I'd lost, myself. Just when I thought the past was firmly behind me, I got one last unexpected reminder. It was a simple white envelope, no return address, sitting in my mailbox like it had been waiting for the right moment to find me. I almost tossed it without opening it. assuming it was junk mail. But something made me pause. When I tore it open, my heart sank for just a moment. It was a letter, from Ethan. Tom, I don't expect you to forgive me. Honestly, I wouldn't forgive me either. But I wanted to say I'm sorry. What happened wasn't just a mistake, it was selfish, and it hurt people who didn't deserve it. I lost a lot after that flight, more than you probably know. Clara? She wasn't what I thought she was. She used me just like she used you, and by the time I realized it, it was too late. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to own up to what I did. I hope, someday, you can move past this and find happiness. You deserve that. Ethan. I stared at the letter for a while, letting the words sink in. Part of me expected to feel the old anger bubbling up, but it didn't. Instead, I felt nothing, because Ethan's apology didn't matter. I didn't need it. I didn't need him to feel guilty to move on. His words were just another reminder that I had already won the only battle that mattered. I had moved forward, while he was still stuck in the mess he helped create. I folded the letter, tossed it in the drawer, and didn't think about it again. That night, as Emily and I sat on the couch with Max curled up between us, I realized something important. Closure doesn't always come from other people. Sometimes, it comes from realizing you don't need anything from them at all. I was free. After that letter from Ethan, something unexpected happened, not in a dramatic, life-altering way, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. It was like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place, even though I didn't know I'd been waiting for it. That letter wasn't about him, or even about Clara, it was about me realizing I didn't need anyone's apology to move forward. But life, as I'd learned, always has one last twist waiting. A few weeks later, while walking Max through the park, I spotted a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, pulling shadows from the past into my present. But as I got closer, there was no mistaking her. Clara. She looked different. Not in the obvious ways, but in the subtle ones you only notice when you've known someone deeply. Her posture was slouched, her eyes duller, lacking the spark they once had. The woman who once navigated life with an air of confidence now looked lost. I could have walked past her. Pretended I didn't see her. But something in me, curiosity, closure, maybe just a final sense of control, made me stop. Clara. She looked up, startled. For a moment, I saw the flicker of the old Clara, the one who could talk her way out of anything, the one who always had an excuse ready. But this time, she didn't mask it. She just stared at me, her lips parting like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Tom, she finally whispered, her voice thinner than I remembered. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. Max sat patiently at my side, as if sensing the importance of the moment. I didn't expect to see you here, she said quietly. I shrugged. Life's funny like that. She gave a small, hollow laugh. Yeah, it is. I could have walked away then. I probably should have. But I found myself sitting on the bench beside her, not because I wanted to rekindle anything, but because I realized I wasn't angry anymore. So, I started, breaking the awkward silence. How's life treating you? Her eyes dropped to her hands, fidgeting with a loose thread on her sleeve. Not great, she admitted. Turns out, betraying the people who care about you doesn't lead to happiness. She glanced at me, searching for some sign of reaction, but I kept my face neutral. And Ethan? I asked, more out of habit than interest. She let out a bitter chuckle. That crashed and burned pretty quickly. He wasn't who I thought he was. But I wasn't who you thought I was either. That admission caught me off guard. For the first time, there was no defensiveness in her voice, no excuses. Just raw, uncomfortable honesty. You're right, I said simply. You weren't. We sat there for a while longer, letting the weight of those words settle. There was no need for more explanations. We both knew the damage had been done, and nothing could change that. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Tom. For everything. I nodded, feeling the truth in her words but also realizing something important. I believe you, I said. But I don't need your apology anymore. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel pity or satisfaction. Just peace. That I stood up, giving Max a gentle tug on his leash. Take care of yourself, Clara. She nodded, wiping her eyes. You too. And with that, I walked away, feeling lighter than I had in months. Later that night, as I sat on the porch with Emily and Max, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I realized something profound. Closure isn't about getting the answers you think you need. It's about finding peace in the answers you already have. After that final encounter with Clara, I felt like a chapter of my life had finally closed. But what surprised me wasn't how final it felt, it was how freeing it was. There were no lingering questions, no unresolved anger, no more wondering if I'd made the right decisions. Life was moving forward, and for the first time, I was moving with it. Emily and I continued to grow closer. What started as casual meetups had blossomed into something deeper, something real. But this wasn't like what I had with Clara. There were no illusions, no expectations built on shaky foundations. With Emily, everything was honest. We could talk about anything, from stupid, trivial things to our biggest fears, without the weight of judgment or pretense. One evening, we were sitting on my porch, Max sprawled between us, snoring softly, when Emily turned to me with a thoughtful look in her eyes. Do you ever think about what would have happened if none of that with Clara happened? She asked. That I thought about it for a second, but the answer was clear. I don't, I said. Because if it hadn't, I wouldn't be here. Emily smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant everything. It wasn't about replacing what I'd lost. It was about building something new, something better. In the months that followed, I started to realize that happiness isn't about avoiding pain, it's about growing from it. I'd been through hell, sure. But I came out the other side stronger, more self-aware, and, most importantly, content. That I stopped comparing my life to what it could have been and started appreciating it for what it was. Every day felt like a gift, not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. One day, Emily and I took Max to the beach. As we walked along the shoreline, the waves lapping at our feet, I realized that the life I'd built after Clara wasn't just a rebound from the past, it was a celebration of the future. And in that moment, with the sun setting over the horizon and Emily's hand in mine, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. It's funny how life works. A year ago, I was sitting on a plane, clueless, thinking that trip to Hawaii would save my marriage. Instead, it destroyed it. But what I didn't realize then was that it wasn't the end of my story, it was just the plot twist I needed. Now, as I sit here with Emily and Max, looking out at the life I've built from the ashes of that betrayal, I can honestly say I'm grateful for everything that happened. Not because it was easy, far from it, but because it taught me lessons I wouldn't have learned otherwise. I learned that trust isn't just about believing in someone else, it's about believing in yourself enough to know when something isn't right. I learned that love isn't about holding on when things are falling apart, it's about knowing when to let go and move forward. And I learned that happiness isn't something you find in another person, it's something you create within yourself. If I could give anyone going through what I went through a piece of advice, it would be this: don't let betrayal define you. Let it refine you. You are stronger than the worst thing that's happened to you. And sometimes, the best chapters of your life begin right after the most painful ones. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time, peace. And I know, without a doubt, that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. It's funny how life works. A year ago, I was sitting on a plane, clueless, thinking that trip to Hawaii would save my marriage. Instead, it destroyed it. But what I didn't realize then was that it wasn't the end of my story, it was just the plot twist I needed. Now, as I sit here with Emily and Max, looking out at the life I've built from the ashes of that betrayal, I can honestly say I'm grateful for everything that happened. Not because it was easy, far from it, but because it taught me lessons I wouldn't have learned otherwise. I learned that trust isn't just about believing in someone else, it's about believing in yourself enough to know when something isn't right. I learned that love isn't about holding on when things are falling apart, it's about knowing when to let go and move forward. And I learned that happiness isn't something you find in another person, it's something you create within yourself. If I could give anyone going through what I went through a piece of advice, it would be this: don't let betrayal define you. Let it refine you. You are stronger than the worst thing that's happened to you. And sometimes, the best chapters of your life begin right after the most painful ones. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time, peace, and I know, without a doubt, that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.